Thank you for being here, for joining us. My name is Marky Miller, and I'm on the communication teams with CELDEF, or Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. We do have audio and video turned off for participants tonight, so don't worry, we can't see you, we can't hear you, we don't have to worry about background noise. We do apologize if this makes it feel like a one-sided conversation, but we had 140 people sign up, so we're trying to limit how many distractions we have, reduce background noise, rogue mics, and echoes can unintentionally be really disruptive. So just to make it easy for you to listen tonight and participate with us, we did set up with that. To get things started, we'll begin with some questions that were submitted in advance with registrations, but feel free to use the chat feature on here if you'd like to submit. So there is a little chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. If you open that, you'll be able to respond to everybody, respond to just the panelists. It's really however you want it. You can select just a certain name. My colleague, Simon Davis Cohen, who is monitoring our chat, is going to look at that. So if you don't feel comfortable posting your question to everybody, you can feel free to just send him a private message. So whatever you're more comfortable with. And we'll be collecting those throughout the night. So we will do our best to get to as many as we can. But keep in mind that this conversation is just an initial step. The door at CELDEF is always open. We're happy to provide contact information afterwards. And if you'd like to reach out to us and expand on anything we talk about tonight, certainly this conversation is not meant to be start to finish all that we can do. This is just to start connecting and hopefully once we're all able to get out there and be in the same room again, really translate these words into actions. So when we planned this webinar back in April, our attention was really only on COVID-19 and how to organize during a pandemic. So obviously things have changed quite a lot in the last few weeks. Grassroots organizing in particular certainly took a hit once shelter-in-place orders were official. And even now, as things begin to reopen, coming together physically isn't always possible. It's not ideal. Not everybody's comfortable with that yet. Here in Ohio, our ability to collect signatures was greatly impeded. And yet our governor has stated that no one should have to choose between their public health and their constitutional rights, and yet fails still to deliver these protections to us. So more recently, the anger and the outrage over the murder of George Floyd has sparked protests nationwide. And we wanted to make it clear, too, that when we're talking about organizing in a time of crisis, we're not talking about the protests in the streets. We're talking about the systemic racism and the injustice that's been embedded into our laws and our society and our culture for decades. A crisis can be very powerful in activating change. For my community in Toledo, Ohio, the loss of our water led us to enact the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Countless local communities are threatened and harmed and burdened with environmental and social problems, and they often know exactly how they would like to change things, but too often we limit ourselves and our power, and we think that we have to put our faith solely in officials and agencies and into elections. So we'd like to use this time tonight to talk about alternatives to that and how we can see our power differently. COVID-19 forced us to find creative ways to change how we work, how we shop, how we teach, how we interact. And it made us see that real structural change was possible, but we shouldn't have to face a life or death scenario in order for that to happen. And while the thought for many of us of, well, if we go outside, we could get sick, we could be met with a fatal outcome, that was a really hard concept for us to deal with. But that's a reality for communities of color, and that's been their reality for a long time. Simple things, being pulled over, buying candy from a convenience store, going for a run, even staying home, have become things that are very dangerous and risky actions that could turn fatal. And so communities of color in this country have been trying to adapt to a harmful system just to survive for too long. And we're seeing that conversation blossoming here, that things do need to change, and this goes far beyond a simple right to have a peaceful protest. This really should be about the realization that the system is not broken, but it's fixed. It's fixed to work against you, against your community, against people of color, against constitutional rights. And sweeping structural change is different from just basic reform, and it has yet to come from a higher level of government in a way that benefits people, that benefits the environment. But I know you didn't join tonight just to listen to me, so I want to introduce our panelists so we can dive into the conversation. We have Tish Odell. Tish is the Ohio organizer for CELDEF, assisting Ohio communities to organize rights-based initiatives in their communities. Tish co-founded the grass rights organization Madion, Mothers Against Drilling in Our Neighborhoods in Broadview Heights, Ohio, that successfully campaigned to adopt the first Home Rule Charter Amendment in Ohio, creating a community bill of rights banning new gas drilling, fracking, and injection wells in the city in 2012. She assisted with the founding of the Ohio Community Rights Network in 2013 and has assisted dozens of communities across the state to draft and propose rights-based laws, including Toledo's Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Chad Nicholson. Chad is the Pennsylvania organizer for CELDEF. He joined CELDEF in 2010 after working with Envision Spokane on a Bill of Rights protecting neighborhoods, workers, and the environment. He then moved on to assist in New England, speaking with communities in Maine and New Hampshire to protect their environment. He now lives and organizes in Pennsylvania, assisting communities to engage in rights-based organizing on issues ranging from environmental protection to prisoners' rights. Kai Hushka. Kai is the Northwest and Hawaii organizer for the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. He is a democracy school lecturer and advisor for both the Oregon Community Rights Network and the Washington State Community Rights Network. Kai has some opening remarks. So Kai, I'll turn it over to you now. Take it away.
Thank you, Marky. Thanks for everyone for being here. This is a kind of a new thing for us as an organization, and I'm really pleased to see how much attendance we have. It's fantastic. I did want to read something that I wrote that will hopefully have some resonance with people that are here tonight, perhaps invoke some thoughts and some questions that we can try to help with in our time together. And this, as Marky laid out, it kind of comes from a couple different contexts. As Marky had said, we had originally had based this on the COVID pandemic, and of course, everything happening since the George Floyd murder has also created another kind of tension as I've been thinking about it. I wrote this. I said, I feel a real tension since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a tension between devolving into the chaos and real ripeness for a great coalescing for deep change, a change bending towards equity and justice for people and the planet. It has made each day quite interesting since the beginning of March. If the pandemic wasn't shocking enough in its pause button-like effect on the world, we've now been catapulted into what feels like a different sphere of equally tension-filled chaos and opportunity, fueled by the justifiable outrage and calls for deep change coming out of the most recent deaths of Black people at the hands of police, really at the hands of an oppressive system. We've all been forced to look outward and inward in a way we haven't before. All of this has made me question our very existence along with what is possible. The pandemic and the resurgence for justice for Black lives have both helped to strip bare the system we have and its inherent problems. COVID-19 for me especially demonstrated a couple of things. One is that it showed many people how our system is really built and ultimately how it is unable to deal with the needs of people and nature. Secondly, it provided a space for each of us to inventory what is and isn't important to us. Taking the language of the time, it really has been an evaluation of what is and is not essential. A third count is that the pandemic demonstrated what mass mobilization could accomplish in bringing the system to its knees. The pandemic was able to do what human organizing has until now, which is bring the machine of capitalism to a near halt. It felt really like nature's way of activating a general strike. I don't say any of this to ignore the real suffering and loss that the pandemic has wrought, and that clearly some of that suffering and loss could have been avoided, but to challenge each of us to learn from these times in order to apply ourselves in a manner that won't just slow or stall the current system, but ultimately dismantle it. COVID-19 and the renewed energy to seek justice for Black lives in this country is all, of course, part of the bigger reality of climate change itself. All three things require resolute focusedness, organization, and the need for greater and greater unity become a greater and greater unity, but a unity that does not compromise with the existing system. To really push that next level, it needs to be a commitment to stand on a defined set of values and then to become effective advocates for those values. That tension of chaos and opportunity is palpable. The system is selfish and will do everything it is in its power to maintain its hold. It will do this both with a heavy hand, but also with veiled offerings to devolve power that in the end do nothing to fundamentally change the system. That tension is there for me, but I'm choosing to invest in opportunity versus being swept up in the chaos. Thanks to my fellow panelists and for all of you out there for letting me read that. And again, I'm very happy to be here tonight.
Thanks, Kai. Thanks for getting us started. And yeah, thank you to all of our panelists for giving us their time tonight. I'm going to get started with the first question, which will be for Tish. And it reads, the climate crisis, COVID as a public health crisis, police brutality, and the racism crisis, democracy crisis, all of these problems, how are all of these connected?
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here this evening, and thanks for that, Marky. As a CELDEF organizer for the last 8 years working on rights-based organizing, and at first, as Marky stated, it was just on environmental issues. It's been hard for me working with communities all these years when talking about issues in community groups on how to connect to these. We've been taught to look at our issues through a single issue lens. So let's say your community's facing a pipeline, and you get everyone together in the community, you notify them that first it's coming and you organize and you form a pipeline opposition group, right? Or your community's facing, let's say, a lack of health services. Maybe something's been cut in the budget. And so the group forms around that to work on universal health care. Then let's say your community, unfortunately, witnesses a young unarmed Black man being killed by police. Now we have a group formed working on reforming public safety. So these are all single issues, but then when each of these groups tries to make the positive change that they believe will be good for the community and fix the problem, we believe we live in a democracy. And if the people just would voice their concerns to the electeds or some agency, that they'll be heard and the issue, whatever it is, will be addressed. But that's not the system that we live under. So for example, the community with the pipeline issue may go to an environmental public hearing. They'll make comments about how this is going to harm the community, maybe the water, the air. But does it stop the pipeline? No. And to make matters worse, maybe the pipeline community, they use the local police then, or sheriff, to protect the pipeline company's interests, paid for though with the people's tax dollars. And then let's say the community group that's in need of healthcare services for residents, learns that there's some big project coming that wants tax abatements and subsidies for like a new stadium, let's say. Well, the people go to council meetings and go, no, we need healthcare services here. And they maybe go to the state. Well, the stadium is approved with corporate welfare money, and then there's no money left, right, for the people and their healthcare services. And the same thing with the police killing in that community. They demand maybe a citizen commission be formed so that they'll be heard. But in the end, do their comments matter? So, just to kind of connect those issues, like you're talking about, Mark, has anything really changed? It's about who's making the rules, the regulations, the laws, and for whose benefit. We have a group in Columbus who's been collecting signatures to put a law on the ballot, which is our right in this state. And the pandemic hit and they couldn't collect signatures anymore because we had a shutdown. Well, their deadline's approaching and they've collected almost all of them and they can't get the signatures. So, democracy is definitely being affected by that. Another example we had today, which just shocked me here in Ohio, was in Dayton. We have a local representative who actually made the comment, and it was, I just can't, I'm going to read the headline because it's like still so unbelievable to me. But he says, he's asking if the colored population, he calls them, are not washing their hands as well as others, and that's why their rate of COVID, and this is a state senator, it's just shocking. I mean, if you put this together with the environmental issues, so people in Toledo, Ohio, who had the water crisis, a new water treatment plant had to go in and be upgraded, and so now the rates are higher for the people. Flint, Ohio. Dayton itself is in the middle of a crisis with their water, and it's because of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Well, people of color and a lot of the communities, in the city and poorer communities, they can't afford. So let's even just say that statement had anything to do with reality. Here's how the environmental issue is connected to this pandemic. And, but they don't even think about that the higher water rates can't even be afforded. So those are just some thoughts I have on, how this is all connected, and we need to start connecting. And I think that's part of what COVID-19 did at the local level. It showed people that all these things, they couldn't, they had to help each other, rely on each other. It wasn't the state and federal government coming in to rescue them. It was the people there themselves.
Thanks, Tish. Yeah, I can definitely speak from at least the Toledo perspective when the pandemic chaos was just becoming news and people were getting worried and the panic buying started to happen. It was very reminiscent of what we experienced with losing our water. People were stocking up on supplies, not knowing how long things were going to last. And to be told that you have to wash your hands all the time, it was like, well, thank goodness we can. If these two things had intersected and happened at the same time, we wouldn't be able to, and we'd have a much higher risk to our public health. Thank you. Kai, the next question is going to go to you. It's a little long. Let me read through it. It says, what do we do to combat the subversion that the powers that be are already working on? Trying to divide, put in false leaders they can manipulate, or have already started grooming to have put in place, pretending to back down while working harder to stop change, etc. We saw it after Vietnam and other uprisings for change, most recently in the Women's March. What do we do to stay united and engaged? People expect instant change, and if they don't get it, they seem to lose interest.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think it's a great question, and it's, pre-pandemic, those are the very things that as a community organizer, we would deal with, and we're still dealing with it. And of course, the pandemic and, the movement for Black Lives, all of that is all very much steeped in that kind of reality about, how do we actually get what we deserve when the system operates the way that it does, when the system in large degree has all the cards, how do you shift it? How do you take control of it? How do you have those things be actualized? Because the system has been very good at not just controlling the moment, but really having the time and energy to think beyond the moments in a lot of cases and prepare for it. I think that is kind of the opportunity aspect that I spoke to earlier. I think in some ways the system was not prepared for what is transpiring. And I think with that is the opportunity perhaps to put some real pressure on and have real fundamental change come about. And I think that's going to come with real pressure from people and perhaps in new and creative ways. So as the power elite, as the system in some ways is kind of reeling to figure itself out, we have an opportunity to maybe actualize those things that were far more difficult before, when we haven't had as great of the destabilization that we're having now. Not as to say that climate change hasn't destabilized things already, but in a way that the shock waves have been much more felt more broadly in these last few months than let's say prior in quite some time. And so I think for me and my observation to that question about how we sort of push through that is really what is it that we want, which is largely where our organizing begins with, is asking people in communities, what is it that you want, or what is it that you demand, and articulate that, and then organize and advocate on those grounds. And I think where the system often wins and basically pulls us back in without really anything changing is when we let go of that, when that compromise comes into play, or when we believe that what is being offered, or the possibilities that are being offered, is the best we can get, and then we pour all our energy into that aspect of it, which largely, when we begin to analyze it, either in the moment or afterwards, is really a lot of organizing based on symptoms and not the root level realities that we're demanding. And I think with both the pandemic and the situation around Black lives that we're dealing with now, I'm hearing a lot of good things in the sense of real calls for fundamental change. And I think what needs to happen is those voices, those ideas need to stay out front, because otherwise, if they get pushed to the back, we're kind of back to where we began. So I think it's going to take real political pressure. It's going to take real demands, whether through traditional forms or untraditional forms, to make that happen. But I think that combination of again, being resolute is going to give us the best chance of pushing through. And I think we have to be comfortable with being comfortable for actually saying what we want. And it seems like a weird thing to say, but working in Oregon, for instance, we've been reaching out to groups there, the Community Rights Network, to talk to other issue groups about really visioning what they want based on the things they've been involved in. So as the pandemic hit, we asked people dealing with forest health, or people advocating for greater stability of local economies, or people dealing with questions around immigrant rights. You know, we asked them a basic question, which is, you know, if the world was the way that you wanted it, what would it look like? Paint us a picture, so that people can kind of really know what to aim for. And it was interesting that most people had a hard time articulating that. They're so steeped into the political realities of what is, that they haven't really afforded themselves the time to really ask what they want. And again, I think the pandemic and the current social unrest now have given us that opportunity to really state what it is we want, and then we have to build around that. So I think those are the keys. I'm not giving very many specifics because I think it gets into the granular level a bit, but in general, I think that's where we have to build from.
Thank you, Kai. We're going to move on to Chad. Your question, has CELDEF drafted any initiatives for state-level governments? As we saw with COVID, state governors stepped up when the federal government either could not or would not. And I think a lot of us are fired up to work harder at the state level rather than individual communities on both rights of nature and community bill of rights to address the climate crisis.
Thanks, Marky, and good evening, everybody. The answer is yes. We have drafted some state constitutional amendments, particularly concerning giving communities the right of local community self-government, that communities should be able to make laws in their best interest, make laws to protect their health and safety, and that would be free from state preemptive laws or from corporate interference. So I imagine a lot of people on this call are aware a state legislature or the federal, or Congress in DC often passes laws that actually removes authority from our communities to make decisions on issues that are important to them. And so when that happens, communities find themselves handcuffed. They say their hands are tied. They don't have the authority to stop fracking or stop a pipeline, or to actually have a community-based police force, or to deal with campaign finance reform on a meaningful community level, to enact community-based labor protections. The list goes on and on. As Tish mentioned, a lot of these issues are related, and they're related in that the system, as it's currently structured, fundamentally denies the people that are most affected by these issues from having any meaningful say over them. So the constitutional amendments, and I think they're available on our website. If not, we'll have our email addresses that we'll post towards the end of this call. Folks can get in touch with me or any of us to be able to get more information. but they really are about changing the constitutional structure, first at the state level, and understanding that the federal constitution definitely needs at least some tweaks, if not a major overhaul itself, to return that power to communities. And so the legislation, that's being put forward isn't specific to single issues. It's more to just whether or not communities have the powers that they need to protect their health and safety, and also to give rights and protections to nature and ecosystems that are far greater than what the state or federal governments currently allow for. So it's not just theoretical, it's not just words on paper. The state stuff has actually been moving. It's been introduced in the New Hampshire House 3 times at this point. In 2018, that was led by Michelle Sanborn, another CELDF organizer up there with the New Hampshire Community Rights Network. But it actually got about 1/3 of the vote in the state house. So it didn't pass, it didn't make it out of committee, or it didn't make it out of the House, but it actually got 1/3 of the support of all the legislators, and it was bipartisan in the state of New Hampshire to give communities the right of local self-government. There's also campaigns that have been happening in Oregon, Colorado, and Ohio. They're at various stages. Where I live in Pennsylvania, the local self-government constitutional amendment was introduced into our state house last year, had several co-sponsors. I think though, well, a couple things. One, it's different in each state, I think, in terms of how people organize around it. So some states, for example, have the initiative process where they can gather signatures on a petition and then put something up for a vote of the people of the state. In New Hampshire and in Pennsylvania, we don't have that option. We actually have to go through our state legislators. So it's kind of ironic that we have to ask our legislators for permission to amend our own constitution, but that's currently the state of things. So in Pennsylvania, though, we've gotten a sponsor and several co-sponsors. They put it forward. But our organizing strategy around it at this point is not to assume that it's going to get enacted or passed by the legislature anytime soon. We're basically looking for a beachhead there that we can then organize with other groups around. So, for example, when the amendment was introduced last year, we didn't go to the Capitol, Harrisburg, and have a big rally there. We actually went to the home district of the legislator that put it forward to meet with her local groups, because this amendment would actually be about giving them more power in their communities. So we're continuing to try to take the state work, but actually keep it focused at the local level. Another example is just last month, we sent out a letter to every municipality in Pennsylvania. It's about 2,700 municipalities, to see if the local legislators want more information on this. And we've had a huge response. And some have actually put forward their own letters that they're sending to the legislature in Harrisburg. They're sending to us, stating their support for the amendment. And this actually also, I think, ties in with another question that I saw in the chat earlier on about what groups do we partner with. Yeah, there's a lot of groups that are now coming on board with this amendment in Pennsylvania. And I think, including just this last week, Poor People's Campaign, a group called March on Harrisburg, several local environmental groups. We do partner with groups, and I think we're partnering with more and more these days. But historically, it's been more difficult for us to partner with some more traditional environmental organizations, for example, because our work is more systemic in nature. It's not about reform or regulation or things like that. It's actually about overhauling the system, maybe taking it down and rebuilding it from scratch. So a lot of the groups that we partner with are local community groups, groups that maybe were never activists before or hadn't been involved in politics or lawmaking or things like that before. But I will say that, particularly around the state efforts, more groups are coming on board. But I do want to reiterate that at least at this point in Pennsylvania, our strategy is not assuming or hoping that anything is going to pass at the state level anytime soon until we actually build the grassroots people's movement to force it through and toss out the folks in Harrisburg.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. I definitely don't see it as an either or strategy. There's room to work at both levels, and we definitely want to highlight the power that's in the grassroots. Tish, just shifting gears a little bit with questions. This question says, due to my age and the pandemic, I'm not able to go to protest. What can I do from home?
Well, sounds like that person is in the same boat that all of us community organizers are in. What I can say is it's really all of this is about sharing information and educating people in your local community, because like Chad said, it's about building at the grassroots and pushing it upward. So I mean, we've had to learn how to do this kind of stuff on Zoom, right? So, but educating via emails, calling people in your community, social media. I mean, there's so much information that's not shared on the corporate media, and so people just don't know about it. I mean, maybe we're in like a small group and we assume because we connect with those people more often that everyone knows about this, but they don't. Maybe you could start a rights-based, I don't know, book club or movie club via Zoom questions. I mean, you want to try to get a diverse group from your community together to be part of this and to help them see the issues that they're facing through this lens, this rights-based lens. So seeing what the common thread is, why the people can't get what they want, why they can't create the just and sustainable communities that they envision. You know, and then of course, when you get some people together that do seem on board with that, you can contact us here at CELDEF. We can schedule a meeting with Zoom, virtual workshop. You know, we're working on our democracy school in a virtual way. So, you know, that would be my suggestion and hopefully they keep talking about this second wave coming and that we may be in this situation for quite a bit longer. So we don't want to give up the organizing. And I just want to I'm just going to make a comment. Is that okay, Marky? About something Kai had said about us, you know, sticking to the issue at hand. Like we've all been galvanized around this, active, but you've already seen like with the police accountability issue and people talking about defunding police departments. So that's totally, you know, and I heard our mayor in Cleveland today talking about it. He means like there wouldn't be any police. Well, that's not what that means. It's creating something new and different that actually works in the community or for the community. But looking at that versus just reform. And I think we have to, you know, we looked to the movements of the past, like especially in the 60s, the civil rights and all that. And sometimes we're focusing obviously on the protests that happened, the direct actions that happened, which we need, but we don't want to now get sucked back into what happened with the compromises that were made. And they really didn't focus on systemic change. And where are we at now? You know, 50 years later, we're back to the same place again. The racism issue didn't really get dealt with. We left the power and the control in the hands of the people who were always making the rules and the laws. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And definitely if there's a question that you guys want to add on to, feel free to jump in and, you know, you don't need to ask for permission. You can be rebels and just take over the call. That's totally fine. I know you're all really good at that, so go for it. Kai, are you aware of projects or interventions at the community level that take an integrated rights-based approach to advocating for both social justice and ecological justice?
Yeah, I think in our world, as far as an example, and it's hard to say if it's a model to fully replicate, but if people are interested, I'm happy after this call to engage with those folks about what transpired. But Spokane, Washington was a place, if I'm hearing the question right, that made an attempt a few years back now to basically look at the community for the community's sake. And that meant looking at it from a lot of different vantage points. As you might have recalled from the start of the call in Marky reading about Chad's bio, Chad was involved in one of the early efforts here in Spokane to move what was really the original Community Bill of Rights, which is a central piece of all the lawmaking work we do today. And that effort was really about pulling what were often isolated, disparate groups together under this idea that we're all struggling with the same barriers of the structure itself. What would it look like if we actually linked arms and gave power to what we're desiring, not just around our individual issues, but collectively. And that meant neighborhood advocates working on unwanted corporate development, linking up with labor union folks dealing with worker rights who were linking arms with local environmental groups on protecting the Spokane River, who were linking up with housing advocates who were trying to help people to have access to housing and so on. And it ended up being a very comprehensive effort to really speak to all these things that the community was woefully missing its mark on, and the power structure itself not really doing anything about it. I mean, to Tisha's point around very lukewarm reformist type actions, but nothing really systemically changing things. And so there was a real concerted effort to see if you could really advocate in a manner that pulled what are traditionally things under social justice and things under environmental justice, and pull that all together and really just advocate for the community for community's sake. And though the laws never passed, even though there were multiple attempts, I think it did get people thinking differently, and differently in my sense, just thinking systemically. So much of what we're fed is fed sort of in isolation, disconnected. Even schooling systems themselves don't do, I think, a very good job of preparing us to be the right kind of critical thinkers and systemic thinkers. And so when you create an opportunity for people to come together and see that you can advocate for one another without lessening what you may have greater passion for, that you can get somewhere and beginning to shift behavior and really shift culture. And I think to the topic at hand here, I think both what's happening around the police brutality, social justice issue around people of color, as well as the pandemic, they both are speaking much more clearly to systems, both in how the system is currently structured and why it doesn't work for us, but also why we ourselves need to think in the manner of being systemic and really braiding these things together. And I'll finish just on what Tish was talking about at the end there, which is, we shouldn't discount ourselves on what's possible, because really the system itself is unreasonable. We're not unreasonable by saying what we've been saying. And so though it may seem politically difficult or politically unfeasible to really ask for what you want in a multifaceted systemic way that braids together the social and the environmental and such, that's not unreasonable to me. That's actually very, very sound, logical, in tune thinking that we really need to be embracing and supporting each other with, because the system itself is what's unreasonable, and let's not forget that. So again, in the topic of tonight, I think there's a real ripeness again for that to come together, and maybe part of it is really to stop dropping the terminologies of social versus an environmental, and let's figure out a unifying way to say that, because they're all connected, all those things. They're not separate or disparate. And part of our own maybe stumbling block is ourselves and how we phrase things and language things. And I'm totally welcome challenging ourselves to figure out how to do this differently. But if people again want to hear more about how things built and organized and advanced in Spokane over the number of years that people were active here, I'm happy to share that.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, I think we definitely need to be really intentional with showing that overlap between social and environmental justice in this movement. And again, it's just one of those things where we have to train ourselves to take a step back and look at it with a systems approach. Chad, question to you, and then I'm going to check in with Simon and take some questions from the chat that he's been collecting. What strategies can be used when a good or worthwhile cause, such as defending environmental rights, is up against money and power, as well as our own local, state, and federal governments?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think local lawmaking and now state lawmaking has been a part of the CELDEF work and strategy. And, people can comment and have their own opinions on how effective they think it's been. On the one hand, the world is burning. It hasn't achieved things quick enough. On the other hand, there's hundreds and hundreds of communities that we've worked with over the years who have enacted local laws and in a lot of circumstances have stopped harmful activities from coming in. I think though, for me, the answer to this question is, and we in CELDEF are often trying to challenge ourselves and our thinking and our strategies. But as Kai mentioned, don't discount what we think is possible or what we can actually be doing in our community. And I think the biggest thing for me when it comes up against wealth and power like that is to stay on offense and to be unpredictable. There's a great quote from a woman named Jane Ann Morris, who is very critical of the environmental regulatory system. And she basically said the only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists, because when we engage in the regulatory system, it makes us very predictable in terms of how we do our work. So, I mean, just a quick example in terms of what this, can look like. And I think it can be different in every community based on how creative and how bold you want to be. But is Grant Township. And I imagine there's several people on this call that have heard of the Grant Township story, but it's a small rural community of 700 people, very poor, in west central Pennsylvania that's been fighting off a frac waste injection well since 2014. The frac waste injection wells carry radioactive toxic waste. They cause earthquakes. They threaten drinking water. They're nasty projects. And their timeline has been basically on offense the entire time. Like they passed originally an ordinance that we worked with them to draft in 2014. Of course, they got sued by the industry. They went to federal court, but they just didn't sit around and wait for the federal court's decision. They assumed that the court was going to rule against them. So the next year, when the court finally did rule against the township, they had actually been putting into place another process where they changed their form of government to become what's called a home rule municipality. So in October of 2015, the federal court overruled the ordinance, and 1 month later, the people of the township voted in a whole new form of government, a new structure of law that reinstated the ban. The year after that, in 2016, they assumed that the court was going to rule against them again, and they enacted a law that, as far as we're aware of, is the first one in the country that legalizes nonviolent direct action in the community to protect the community from injection wells. So they actually have an assumption that the system is going to be working against them, and they were putting into place measures that said, we're going to protect people who want to come in here and actually stand in the streets physically to block the harm that may be facing our community. The year after that, they got sued, not by the industry, but they got sued by their own state Department of Environmental Protection. The state DEP sued the community and tried to force in the injection well. Granite Township then countersued them. And actually just a couple of months ago, in that case, the DEP reversed course and actually revoked the permit for the injection well. So throughout all this time, there's no injection well in Granite Township. That was actually the first community in the nation as well that we're aware of where the local rights of nature law was actually used to force a state agency to deny a permit for an industry like a frac waste injection well. So I guess, there's a lot of back and forth there. I don't want to take up too much time with it, but I guess my point is, the community continued to be creative. They continued to stay on offense. When they got losses in the courts or when they were told they couldn't do X, Y, Z, they didn't believe it. And they continued to find other ways and strategies to continue to keep the pressure up and make sure that the rights of their community is what's front and center. So, I think that's kind of in line, it can be pretty despairing as we look around the world these days. Things are rough out there. And I think, we can take inspiration from communities like Grant and the hundreds of others that have stood up for what they think is right. We can also take inspiration from past people's movements. We talk a lot in some of our courses about the suffragists, the labor and civil rights movements, the abolitionists, the same-sex marriage movement. And, these were all long-term struggles. And I think, a lot of them took 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and they had a lot of fits and starts, and there was a lot of losses. And there was a lot of despair within those groups of people as they kept getting beaten back, but they didn't lose sight of what their goal was. And I think that's, the question for me right now, and maybe for our work, is, do we have that kind of time? A lot of people say we don't, that the planet's in too much trouble. I would probably tend to agree with that. But, that means I think that we need to continue to stay on offense and come up with more creative ways of doing things. And the last, thing I want to say on it is, I think when people consider global climate change, they feel like, what can they do as one person? That the problem is too big. And one other quick story, a place called Tamaqua in Pennsylvania was the first community in the world to pass a rights of nature law in 2006. And in 2008, that was actually transferred down and taken up by people in Ecuador, and they passed it into their national constitution. So I guess just to say that taking bold action in your community, even if it seems crazy at the time, or even if it seems like there's nothing you can do, can actually have meaningful effects and big time ripples across the world. And I think we just need more people that are willing to stand up for what they believe in and do some crazy shit.
Yeah, well said. I think that's really the big takeaway. Thank you, guys. I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the chat now. So these won't be directed to anybody in particular, so feel free to answer them. I will touch base real quick. There was a question about move to amend's federal constitution amendment. And I'll just bring up that we actually, as an organization, talked about that today, and definitely will be in touch, hoping to work with them to discuss with Move to Amend further on that. And we definitely agree that money in politics is a big issue and recognize that as a staff. So hopefully we'll have more collaboration with Move to Amend in the future to talk about. Let's see, there was a question that says, these marches are youth-led. How can we reach out to them and encourage them and help them develop their minds for, help them develop their demands for systemic change? And the marches are referring to the Black Lives Matter movement, but I think we saw the same thing with the climate march and climate justice.
Marky, I'll just really quick, I'll just say something about that. You know, that's one of the things we talk about, like what's the difference between a moment and a movement, right? And so obviously people are in the streets because something motivated. I mean, there's something that like it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? And so they're out there, but is there a strategy beyond that? March, I think we saw that, you know, we see that a lot of times. People get very emotionally charged about a single or an issue at the time, and then they just can't take it, get out in the streets. And our work is kind of the opposite. So we've got this strategy, but there aren't people out there, you know, ready to march for it yet. So this is the moment, I think, that, you know, Kai was talking about, and building on what Chad said, like not enough time, but we never know when these events are going to happen. And so it's important that we take advantage of them when they do happen. And so I don't want people to give up. In the local place, we talk about local a lot and building up, and I think that's critical. Where a lot of us think we have to start at the top. You know, they send us right to the federal level or the state level, and that's much more controlled by the elite minority. And so it makes it very difficult. And I can tell you, while you're, you know, working, a lot of us get diverted and are working on the presidential election coming up. They're busy sneaking things in that we're not paying attention to that are actually stripping us of our rights. So, you know, and then we go after the election happens and we like try to do something, we realize, oh crap, this is what they did while we weren't paying attention. And locally is really what impacts our lives more on a day-to-day basis, I would say. And I think COVID again showed us that. You also can put a lot more pressure on your local community and your local electeds because they're there. I mean, the state and the federal electeds, a lot of times you can't get to. It's hard to do that. But locally, I mean, they see you in the grocery store. They're drinking the same water. You know, they have the same kinds of healthcare issues. So if you are creative, and even the money in politics, we talked about, you know, Move to Amend has come up on a lot of the chat. I'm saying, you know, why not pass a local law first, or try or push for that if you really believe that that shouldn't be, you know, to stop corporations outside your community from funding campaigns to defeat issues in the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Toledo's familiar with this. We had BP who put in over $300,000 to try and defeat that effort. So, you know, I think we really do have to, what Chad and Kai said about envisioning the communities that we want and fighting for that. Don't give up on that. Don't be defeated by, you know, something not going exactly the way you wanted. You keep pushing, because it's that continuous pushing that's going to force some change.
Thanks, Tish. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, I was going to say on the idea of youth and what we can do, let's say, as older people. I mean, to build off of what Tish said in the sense of the general environments we're working in. I think for me, it's about letting them lead, and not co-opting them, not polishing what they say, not speaking down to younger people. You know, I think it's about letting them go for it, and, you know, just saying, hey, we're here and available, or make suggestions and be guides. But if the youth are mobilizing in a way that's really looking to be effective, then they should, you know, full speed ahead. And that also may mean calling out other organizations that are trying to get in the way. I mean, my recollection of the Black Lives Matter movement, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson there, that there was a lot of course, national outcry when that happened, but then fairly quickly, a lot of co-opting that I think really squashed the local organizing and squashed the voice of the youth there. And I think if anything, we be helpful of the youth who are trying to do what they're doing, but then that may also mean, you know, helping by really calling out those who are trying to co-opt them. So I think there's a couple different things we can do to help.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to add into what Tish was saying too. It was not just BP funding it, but BP out of Houston, Texas. So definitely a little far removed from our community here in Toledo. Yeah, I think that's great. And there was a question earlier about whether or not we're connecting with the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups to help assert their demands, and are we discussing with them community rights and right to local self-governance? And I certainly think I agree with what was said earlier, that the key thing though is making sure that the voices in that leadership are what are heard and that they're kept at the forefront of that movement. So absolutely, we are open. We signed on in support of the Movement for Black Lives platform a couple weeks ago. And we certainly want to help reinforce that demand for community control. But I don't think anyone at CELDF wants to assert themselves as going in and taking the lead on that effort. So it definitely has to be more collaborative. We are quickly running out of time here. So thank you everyone for your patience. We still got a lot of questions we didn't get to, and we'll do our best to make sure that we do something to respond to people. We're still collecting all of those. At this time, if any of the panelists want to make just a few closing remarks, feel free to do that.
Well, I'm happy to, if there's a quick question you want to throw out, Marky, I'd be happy to tackle that while we're here all together and do it that way and kind of interlace whatever final closing comments we have at the same time.
Yeah, sure. One of the questions we had was, you spoke of climate change and many other issues, and I wonder how we get past the polarization that is prevalent in our society. It seems that people have made up their minds on these issues. So how do we move the needle toward changing this?
That's an awesome question. It's one that folks I work with in Oregon talk about all the time. Largely it's put in the context of sort of urban versus rural, and just how do we get people to see that we're more on the same page than not. I don't have a magic bullet answer for that. I think the pandemic again is maybe created an opportunity to have some of those discussions that maybe weren't as easy to have before. And if anything, just being open to talking and seeing where things go. In some cases, you're not going to get there, and I think that's where the value system clash is probably going to take place. So that if there's a certain value system that we want to assert and others are just in denial of it or in opposition to it, well, you're going to have that clash. So I think it's this combination of standing for what you want, advocating for it, but also this openness to maybe continue to try to talk to people who aren't there yet. Though I think, again, that the pandemic may have created some opportunity to have more of those discussions. So I think it's just constant pressure and being resolute and diligent about holding those two things. You know, what do you want, but also being open to talk to others to find some common ground. And thanks everyone for being here tonight.
Thanks, Chad. Do you want to make any remarks?
Yeah, just very quick. I'm not going to deny that there's polarization or that there's not real divides in our communities, either when it comes to climate change or other seemingly intractable issues. But I do think, in my experience organizing, that a lot of those divides are much more in our heads than what it's actually like when we get out and talk to people. I mean, I understand it. Nobody wants to go talk to their neighbors and try to convince them to sign a petition or come out to a hearing or something like this. And it's almost universal too, in my experience, that everybody thinks that their community is the most apathetic or the laziest or whatever. And, you know, I think those are just opinions that we all hold a lot about, or about a lot of situations. But I've seen those divides be broken down in a lot of other places that I've worked in Pennsylvania. We've actually had a lot of what are traditionally conservative communities that have enacted some of the more progressive rights of nature laws. So I guess just to say, I think that the hardest part of this stuff and of organizing is having the endless conversations with people that we need to have to both educate as well as come up with new creative solutions. And I think the only, you know, real limitation that we have here, except for maybe time, is our own creativity. And, you know, I or we at CELDEF shouldn't necessarily be looked to for the answers or solutions here. I think the only limitation is what's in our brains.
Thanks so much. Tish, any closing remarks?
Sure. Just to build on that, I put something in the chat in case any of you haven't seen that movie. It's really good, called The Best of Enemies. To show in a community, I think you can find common ground. I mean, you start off in common ground. You live in the same community. You share the same space. It's the most obvious thing that you have in common. And so that 1% loves to divide us, right, on all these, and polarize us on all these other single issues. And it's up to us, but when you do make those connections and build those relationships and focus on that, hey, we all share this space, is what's best for this community and this space, I think you will find common ground. I mean, that's what I found in my community when I worked on it, and in a lot of the other communities we've helped. You know, it does take some effort, but it is all about relationship building, I think, and finding common ground. And thanks everybody for participating tonight and listening to us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're at 8 o'clock, right on the dot. So good timing, everybody. Organizing is usually so chaotic. It's nice to see it work out nicely once in a while. We will be sending out a recording of this. So if you didn't catch the beginning, or you want to share any of the information with your network or your community, that will be available tomorrow. And if you check out the chat, we do have the emails of the organizers that were panelists tonight. So be sure to reach out to us. celdef.org is our website. You can also do info@celdef.org as an email if you just don't know who to go to or where to start. And hopefully we'll be able to connect with everybody in the future. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night.